Hi everybody, I'm back. This is going to be our second video lesson in the use of the very powerful Excel feature known as pivot tables. Alright, now I've already had a question from someone from our first lesson about why I did not take this raw data that we're using and put it into a regular table that we've already learned how to create in an earlier lesson leading to badge number 2. The answer is, well, I just didn't want to. I didn't want to complicate things. But to answer that person's question, can this data be in a table? The answer is yes, of course it can. As a matter of fact, there's a distinct advantage to putting this into a table before we create a pivot table. So I'm going to take that same data and I'm going to get rid of this comment down here. Note that data is not in a table, and I'm going to put it in a table for you. I also want to point out that I did one other thing after the lesson, the last lesson, way down here in the lower left, and someone reminded me that my cursor is not visible in the middle of my Excel sheet, only at the very top and very bottom. So I'll explain things verbally as we go. So way down here on the lower left, you've learned how to change the titles of the different sheets within a file. The raw data is on tab number 2. I named it Data. And on the second tab that we created, which has now become the first tab, because that's the point of our emphasis here in this lesson, I titled it Pivot. You'll remember that you right-click on that tab in order to change its name, and then you will just simply rename it. Okay? Alright, so let's go back to the raw data and let's put it in a table from our previous lesson leading to badge number 2. I'm going to left-click, hold and drag, and highlight everything, including the headers. Make sure you get the headers in there, ladies and gentlemen. I come up here to the ribbon, and in the upper left, the second command is Insert. I left-click on that, and I click on Table, the third icon over. What is the data? I'm just going to accept that data and click on OK. There it is. That's a conventional table, as you've already learned. I'm going to change it up here in the ribbon. Instead of that blue on blue, I'm going to make it orange just to make the reading easier. All right, now you've created a table. Does that make any difference in our pivot table? No, it does not. And it does add a feature that's going to come in very handy, as I'll demonstrate to you later. I'm going to click on Pivot and go back to my pivot table page, and let's recap everything that we looked at. I want to repeat one very important rule to you, by the way. If you are going to use any of these columns, like customer, seller, if you're going to use those as anchors in your pivot table, you don't want to have any blank rows in there. You want to make sure there's some data in there. Even if the amount is 0, make sure that you filled in the customer, the seller, so that you don't create false results in your pivot table. All right, that's a very important thing to remember. I'm going to click back on Pivot again, and let's look at what we did. We wanted, and oh, by the way, notice that my cursor is out here in the main area of the spreadsheet. I'm in column D, row 16 right now. If I click anywhere within the pivot table we created, that little tool in this version of Excel is called the Pivot Table Builder reappears. Now this is a very handy device. You can do it by using commands at the top of the page, but we're going to stick with using the drop-down called the Pivot Table Builder in our lessons here, because again, as I said before, Excel gives you more than one way to get to where you're going. Okay? You'll notice that there are field names in this Pivot Table Builder, and you'll notice 4 squares: filters, columns, values, and rows. All right, when we started creating our pivot table, our goal was to create a table that shows how many sales dollars our sellers were responsible for. We have 4 salespersons, Barry, Jones, Lyons, and Reese, and we wanted to see how many sales dollars they had created for our company, and then we wanted to subsort it by who made those numbers up, which customers. In the case of Lyons, for example, Mr. Lyons sold 22,100, and that was by selling to Concord, Darien, and Penton, and you see the 3 amounts that made up his 22,000. Okay, now where you place in these 4 squares in the Pivot Table Builder, where you place the data that feeds you and the values that result is going to depend on where you place data in those squares. All right, we came up here, let's look at the Pivot Table Builder, and we started by checking seller. You'll recall that Excel didn't know what you wanted to do at first, so it assumed you wanted to count how many salespeople and how many customers you had, and we did not want that. So I dragged customers and sellers over to the rows square, the lower left square. Okay? And then Excel said, well, okay, for those people, what do you want? I wanted to know how many dollars they sold. So that's a value. And I placed that in the values, the lower right square. And that's how we got this set of data over here, sorting first by seller and then by customer for each of those sellers. And the grand total, I want you all to keep that in mind, 133,400, okay? We'll refer back to that later if we start changing any data, okay? Now, where do we start? Let's start by looking at the format. If I go back to my raw data, you'll notice that you know how much I like commas, right? I don't want to confuse 15 million with 1.5 million, okay? So use of commas when you deal with large dollar amounts is highly recommended. By the same token, I'm not interested in pennies. I want to stick with whole dollars. Sound familiar? This was formatting as we learned it way back in Badge 1. So you'll notice that my commas, my nice commas here in column E in my raw data, did not carry over to my pivot table. First thing I want to do is I want my commas. So how do I go about doing that? A couple of ways. The easiest one, excuse me, is to highlight B4 through B22. I just left click, held, and dragged to highlight that data. Now, depending on which version of Excel you have, what you do next might vary, but it's going to intuitively bring you back to things you've already done to change how data looks to you. I am going to put my cursor anywhere in that highlighted area of column B within the pivot table. I'm going to right click once. Okay, what do you think we ought to do? Well, in more recent versions of Excel, it might say something like value field settings, something like that. But you all know by now that if you want to change the appearance of numbers, like commas and chopping off pennies, which in this case are pretty useless, you'll agree, it's format cells. That is the first choice that's been given to us in this little drop-down that the right click produced for us. I'm going to left click on that line, format cells. All right, does that look familiar? You have seen this before, ladies and gentlemen. I want to change numbers. I'm going to left click on where it says number. Okay, I don't want decimal places, so I'm going to drop decimal places down to 0. And I want my 1000 separated, so I'm going to highlight that box. And I'll leave everything else intact. I'm going to left click on OK. And there it is. Now that's what I want. That's how I like my numbers to look. Okay, so that is how you format the data that is in a pivot table. You do have control over this. Okay, excuse me. All right, now what I'd like to do is take a closer look at that tool we've been using called the Pivot Table Dropdown or the Pivot Table Builder. I bring that back by clicking anywhere in my pivot table. There it is. Now anything that this Pivot Table Builder does, you have other means to get to it. Please notice, let me turn that off again. I'm going to go back into the main area of my spreadsheet that turns the Pivot Table Builder off. Now I want you to watch the ribbon very carefully. Okay, we've seen all these tabs before. Now as soon as I click within the pivot table to bring my Pivot Table Builder back, watch that ribbon very carefully. Okay, you'll notice, like we saw before when we dealt with conditional formatting, that a couple of new tabs appear. That's going to be very important to us. Okay, so now I'll tell you what, let's take a closer look at that builder. And you notice that we click on the headings like we did back here. Okay, by customer, by amount, by seller. Okay, we turn them on or we turn them off. Oh, now look what happened. I turned seller off. Now when I turn it back on, once again, it thinks I want a count of the sellers. I don't want a count of the sellers at all. I want to know a sortation within the rows by seller. That row, that value belongs in the rows box. Not the lower right, but the lower left. I'm going to left click, hold, and drag it back to its rightful home. Okay, there it is. I want customers to come secondly. You'll notice Excel still doesn't know what I want to do, so it put customers first. So I'm going to click on customer and drag that underneath. That's the pivot table we started with. Are you getting a feel for how we can manipulate some of this data? Okay. So please remember, when you click on some of these headings, ladies and gentlemen, up here in the field name, Excel is going to try to make a determination about where you would like it. That doesn't mean you've got to have it. It doesn't mean you have to keep it. And by the way, if you want to count your customers, you can. I don't want to, but you do have that option. And I'll get into that. If not today, I'll get into that in maybe our third pivot table lesson. Okay. All right, now let's play with the part number. Go back to your field name here, ladies and gentlemen, and let's click on the word pot, okay? Turning it on. Now, Excel isn't sure what we're going to do with it. It wants to sum it, okay? Well, we don't really want to sum the pots, okay? Part numbers aren't something that you sum together like dollars. Right away, it assumes that we want it in values, and we do not. Okay? So Excel made an assumption that happens to be wrong. Adding up your part numbers does not make any sense. Okay? So it assumed you wanted a value and you don't want it there. So let's try dragging it. Okay? I'm going to left click and hold on that thing in the values box that says sum of pots. And I want to try dragging it to the rows. Watch what happens. Now look at that. Now, we initially totaled up, let's get back to 133,000, ladies and gentlemen. That's the grand total that we've got, right? Okay, first we sorted by salesperson, Barry, Jones, Lyons, and Reese. Secondly, we summed by customer. In the case of Barry, Concord, Ibex, and Ridgeway. Okay? But now we're saying of Concord, for example, Ibex and Ridgeway both each bought pot 2132 only. Concord bought two pots from us, 2038 and 2132. So the total of pot 2038 and 2132, respectively, are 15,000 and 11,500. Friends, if you have a ton of columns here in your raw data, you can do all kinds of subtotals, sub-subtotals, and so on. You get the idea. And look how few clicks it took us. Is this an efficient tool or what? Okay? All right. So now you see Ms. Barry's results not only by customer, but by pot. Now what I want to do is let's take that pot in the lower left in the rows box and let's left click, hold, and drag it to columns. Oh, watch what happens now. All right. You see what happened there? All right. Barry is still 41,900 in total, and you can see her three customers broken out by who makes up that 41,900. But now, instead of subtotaling by rows, which I think you'll agree was a little sloppy to read, okay, now you can actually see it by column, more like an Excel spreadsheet. So we're turning our pivot table into something not only with row subtotals, but with column subtotals as well. So Concord's 26,500 that contributed to Ms. Barry's overall total of 41,900, we can see is made up of 15,000 of part 2038 and 11,500 of 2132. Okay? All right. Let me see, what else? So we have seen how to use columns, we've seen how to use values, we've seen how to use rows. The upper left box filters, now I'm going to save that one. Okay, because that's another very powerful tool. It is a sortation tool. Let's say that it combines some of the best attributes in a pivot table of sortation, as you've learned it, and filtering, along with summarizing data under certain conditions, as you learned in our conditional formatting lesson. Okay, so the best of those worlds will be combined when we use the upper left square. I'm going to hold off on that one, just for the moment. Okay, let me see. One final thing I'm going to do that I'll show you today is when it comes to column headers, okay, the headers, for example. And by the way, I'm just going to get rid of part for now by unclicking part. And let's get back to our original table. Now, you remember from dealing with tables that this little drop-down arrow, it looks like it's in cell A3, but that's really a header. Okay, in this so-called pivot table. And those little drop-down arrows give you all kinds of handy little tools that you can use. All right? I'll get to filtering later, but in the meantime, I'm going to left-click on that little drop-down arrow to the right side of the heading that says Row Labels. Okay? Now, this is a little sorting filter. Right now, Excel is assuming that I want all of my sellers. Now, let's say the boss says to you, well, Alan, I'm not interested in all 4 salespeople. I really only want to focus on Mr. Jones and Miss Reese for this analysis. Okay? Well, right now, in this little seller dropdown, as you can see, why seller? Well, that's because that was my primary sortation in column A. And you'll notice that all of them are checked in this little sellers dropdown. It says select field seller. Yes, I selected that. But it wants all right now. All 5 in this little screen you see at the bottom of this dropdown are checked. So I'm going to uncheck select all. And I'm just interested in Jones and Reese. So instead of selecting all 4 salespeople, I'm just going to click on Jones. And I'm going to click on Reese. That's a left click, by the way, friends. And you see what happens, okay? I've basically eliminated Ms. Barry and Mr. Lyons from this table because the boss doesn't want to see the entire 133,400. She only wants to see those 2 individuals, okay? So I'm going to change this all back by undoing. And I think I have time to show you one more little trick today, so let me get to that. Bear with me. Okay, back to the pivot table. All right, it's still giving me, let me bring all of my salespeople back by clicking on select all. There we are. Okay, that's the pivot table that we started with. All right, the last thing I want to show you today, I alluded to, was the advantage of putting this data into a table. I erased the table, I'm going to put it back. I'm going to highlight all my raw data. I'm going to insert a table. There it is. I'm going to change the color to make it easier to see. Okay, now I indicated before that it might be to your advantage to use a table instead of raw data as I did in my last lesson. Why is that? You'll recall that when we add something, let's say it's invoice 3041. All right. Now you notice the table expanded automatically. If this were raw data, that would not happen. Okay, I'm going to take Ibex, for example. I'm going to make this pot number 1039, and I'll make it for $10,000, and our rep will be Mr. Jones. Okay? So once again, we've seen the benefit of a table. Now, one of the benefits of a table when we were doing charting was that the chart would automatically update. If you had a chart feeding off this data and it were not in a table, the chart would not update. You'd have to do the chart all over again with the new range of data. Now, by using a table, the chart will automatically update. Now, let's see what happens to a pivot table. Will it follow the same convention? I click on Pivot tab. All right, now it hasn't updated yet. It still has the same total as before, 133,400. What do? All right, if you're in the pivot table, up in the ribbon, that little tab, Pivot Table Analysis, the first one from the right, it says Pivot Table Analysis and Design. You're going to click on that. Now look at this. Here's the thing about a pivot table. It will automatically update, but not until you tell it to. So now follow the icons across from left to right, and you see the one about halfway across. It says refresh. I'm hovering over it with my cursor right now. I'm going to click on refresh, and I want you to watch that number, the grand total down below. There it is, friends. We added $10,000 for Ibex, managed by Mr. Jones. Okay? The pivot table has now updated for that 10,000 because you clicked on that refresh tab. It is now 143,400, and that sale has been attributed to Mr. Jones and under his accounts to Ibex. That is the refresh function. So by having the feeder data, as we'll call it, in a table, it will update the pivot table automatically, but only when you hit that refresh button. Okay? If that were raw data, that would not have happened. Refresh would have done nothing for you. Again, that is the benefit of using a basic table rather than raw data to feed any other object, whether it be a chart or a pivot table itself. All right, that is all for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll be back with another lesson on pivot tables very shortly. Bye-bye.